Good evening. My name is Bill Lucy. I am the chairman of the board of the Newport County Preservation Society of Newport County. I'd like to welcome you and everyone that is online to this evening to the Breakers. Tonight, I am very pleased to welcome you all to the John G. Winslow Lecture, which concludes our summer series of 2023. Thank you to everyone who has supported the lectures this summer and joined us. They've been terrific. John Grenville Winslow, the person for whom this lecture is named, served as the president of the Preservation Society's board from 1977 to 1989. Anyone who knew Mr. Winslow will remember how knowledgeable and interested in history he was. He knew Newport, the families of Newport, and all of the people of Newport as if they were his relatives. And if you were ever invited on a tour of the neighborhood with him, you could always expect to be out and about for about 4 or 5 hours. Mr. Winslow played a huge role in growing this organization in the late 70s and through the 80s. He stayed very active with the Preservation Society until he died at the age of 93 in 2011. I know that Mr. Winslow and his wife Helen, who was equally active with the Preservation Society, would be very pleased with tonight's lecture. Just a note, we are in the process of finalizing our fall lineup of lectures, so please stay tuned for what will be a wonderful fall lecture series that we look forward to sharing with you soon. So please keep a lookout on our website and sign up for our emails. And while you're at it, on the website, if you're not already a member, please consider becoming a member of the Preservation Society. Tonight, it is my pleasure to introduce our guest speaker, Phillip James Dodd. Excuse me, I'm sorry, I lost my space here. He's the author. Tonight's lecture is An American Renaissance, An Architect's Impact on the Gilded Age. Mr. Dodd is one of today's foremost experts on classical architecture and interiors. Born and raised in the United Kingdom, he is an alumnus of the prestigious Prince of Wales Institute of Architecture in London. More than 20 years ago, he moved to America. And after training with some of the most recognized classical architectural firms in the country, he founded his design firm, Phillip James Dodd, Bespoke Residential Design Limited. Since then, he has become one of the most sought-after young residential designers practicing today, with designs that can be found in Manhattan, Greenwich, Palm Beach, and as far away as Bangalore, India. Mr. Dodd has lectured extensively throughout the United States on the subject of classical architecture and is the author of 2 best-selling books, The Art of Classical Details, Theory, Design, and Craftsmanship, written in 2013, and An Ideal Collaboration, written in 2015. Tonight, Mr. Dodd will explore 5 of the homes featured in his 2021 book, An American Renaissance, Beaux-Arts Architecture in New York City. Mr. Dodd's presentation will focus on the lavish interiors that reflect the opulence of the Gilded Age, often providing us with a glimpse inside buildings not otherwise viewable to the public. He will also share the stories of the patrons and architects who designed these spectacular homes, the symbiotic relationship of high society between Newport and New York, and their influences on the television adaptation of Julian Fellowes' The Gilded Age on HBO. It should be noted that Julian Fellowes wrote the foreword to Mr. Dodd's book, which will be on sale at the reception following this evening, and Mr. Dodd will be present, I think, to sign books for us. So thank you very much for that. We will have time at the conclusion of the presentation for some questions and answers. There's a microphone, as you were indicated earlier, over where Leslie is, right behind this light. We'll bring it out into the floor, but if you have any questions, I encourage you to please go to the microphone and have at it. That'd be great. Don't be shy. Again, I'd like to introduce Mr. Dodd. We are delighted to have you here tonight at the Breakers.
I think if you were going to use just one word to describe the Gilded Age, it would be opulence. and it doesn't get much more opulent than the Great Hall at the Breakers. So a big thank you to Bill, to Trudy, to everyone at the Preservation Society for inviting me to talk with you this evening. Let's get started. So tonight we're going to be looking at some of the material from my book, An American Renaissance, Beaux-Arts Architecture in New York City. And over 412 pages, we tell, and spanning from 1875 to 1928, we tell the story of not just 20 buildings, but the stories of those people that designed and commissioned them. And just before I forget, and I always do, the front cover is the interior of General Grant's tomb. This was completed in 1897, and when it was finished, for the remainder of the Gilded Age, this was actually the second most visited building in New York City, behind only the Statue of Liberty. And now everybody has forgotten about it, and people just remember it with Groucho Marx and who's buried in Grant's tomb. But by only featuring 20 buildings, it allows us to really showcase some wonderful buildings. The Frick Collection, New York Public Library, the University Club, were able to dedicate over 30 pages of text and new photography to those buildings. And so with that in mind, there's a couple of people I just want to thank quickly. On the left is Jonathan Wallen, my collaborator, who took all of the wonderful photographs that you're going to be oohing and ahhing about tonight. And then, of course, next to him is Lord Fellowes, Julian Fellowes. And when I started work on this book, I realized I needed somebody famous to write the foreword, because nobody knows who I am. And at the time, Downton had just finished, and there was rumors that he'd be working on an American version of Downton. So I thought, that would be great. And so I was able to get in touch with him, which perhaps I'll talk about later on over an alcoholic beverage. And he agreed to write the foreword. And then after that, it was just very serendipitous that it would take me 5 years to write the book, and it would take him 5 years to finish what would become the Gilded Age, which is why everybody's here this evening. And I have it on good authority, wink, wink, nudge, nudge, that season 2 is coming out in late September. So I'm a big believer that the success of a TV series or a book or an architectural design really comes down to good storytelling. And so this evening, we're going to take a brief glimpse inside some of the homes featured in the book and tell the stories of their famous residents. And we're going to start off with the Samuel Tilden House at 15 Gramercy Park. This is not to be confused with the Samuel Tilton House, which is here in Newport, designed by McKim, and White. But this plus-size brownstone is very much one of the inspirations behind the Van Ryan House in the TV series. And it was the home of this gentleman, Samuel Jones Tilden, who was the anti-corruption governor of New York City, who brought down Boss Tweed and his ring. And riding this wave of popularity, he ran on the Democratic ticket for the presidency in the election of 1876. And despite winning 51% of the electoral, of the popular vote, he lost the election by 1 vote in the Electoral College to Rutherford B. Hayes. Now, I think most people, when they think of that, they think of Hillary Clinton, they think of Al Gore. I think the thing that's important with those two is because of third-party candidates, they never cracked 50%. This is the only person who ever did and still lost an election. And so licking his wounds, he comes back to New York City and he purchases 2 adjacent Greek Revival townhouses that were built in the 1840s overlooking Gramercy Park. And in 1884, he decides to convert these into a single residence. And while he's doing this conversion, he decides to add an escape tunnel at the back because he was worried about reprisals from the Friends of Boss Tweed. And he hires Calvert Vaux, the English architect best known as the architect of Central Park, to design this for him. And Vaux had worked or trained under Andrew Jackson Downing, and he's best remembered as being the staunch proponent of the Victorian Gothic architecture that's prescribed by John Ruskin in The Stones of Venice. And you can see from the awning in this shot that the house is now the National Arts Club. It was converted by George Post in 1905 which is when the gardens and the escape tunnel were demolished and built over. But on the outside of the house, you have this wonderful detail. The sandstone was brought over from Scotland, and it was combined with sandstone from New Jersey, as well as granite and marble. And the little plaque on the right kind of gives an idea of what you're going to find inside. And the main salon area, the living room, this is very much a space that you can imagine Agnes Van Ryan entertaining in the TV series. This was all decorated by Herder Brothers and very much that kind of old money taste. And interestingly, you'll see the ceiling and you'll see the mirror over the fireplace. And this is a detail of the ceiling. This is by John Lafarge, this beautiful turquoise blue tile. And this was done as well as the mirror over the ceiling because back then there was no electric lights. Everything was kerosene lighting. And so this was done in the evening to reflect the light and make the space feel a lot brighter than what it was. And then you can see this is what is now the club bar. Used to be Samuel Tilden's private library. There was over 20,000 volumes of books in there. And then a detail of the glass ceiling has got this beautiful mosaic, almost Islamic kind of pattern, which was crafted by a gentleman called Donald MacDonald. Try saying that fast. From Boston. And again, it would be 6 years before electricity came to this part of New York City. So you see it now backlit beautifully, but when this was created, it didn't look like that. And when Tilden dies in 1886, he has no heirs, and so he instructs his trustees to use his fortune and his vast library collection to create what would become New York Public Library. And if you walk up to the library, you look up at the attic, you'll see the inscription that New York Public Library was actually an amalgamation of 3 separate libraries. Up until this point, there was no library in New York. And so it's the Tilden Trust, it's the Astor Library, and it's the Lenox Library. And poor Tilden, everyone forgets about him, the 2 lions at the front, Fortitude, Patience and Fortitude. Originally, they were Leo Lenox and Leo Astor. There was no Leo Tilden, unfortunately. But even before the Tilden House was finished, it was very much considered old-fashioned and almost naive because this had been built 2 years earlier in 1882, this elegant and sophisticated French chateau that you all know, which was built for William and Alva Vanderbilt, the Petit Chateau, designed by Richard Morris Hunt in a style that would become known as Vanderbilt Gothic. And while the architecture and the architect are different from the story, this is very much the inspiration of the Russell House in the TV series, The Gilded Age. And when this house, this has literally transformed architecture in America. People often ask me, what is the greatest architectural loss? And the standard answer to that is Penn Station. Well, you could make an argument that this is up there with that because of the impact that it had, because without that house, we wouldn't have this house. And we're now at this point where I kind of feel like that anybody stood in this magnificent building is contractually obligated to have to talk about Richard Morris Hunt. He's the first American to go to the École des Beaux-Arts in Paris. The second is H.H. Richardson. The third was Charles McKim. After that, the floodgates open. Almost every architect of consequence follows them. There are a couple of exceptions. Stanford White didn't go, George Post didn't go, and neither did Daniel Burnham. But they did make sure that their sons all attended after them. And while they're there at the École, they don't learn a single style of architecture. Instead, they learn about the architecture of ancient Greece and ancient Rome, of the Italian and French Renaissance. And then they travel around Europe and they discover the medieval architecture in France and England. And they come back to the States and they amalgamate all of these styles together in what would become the American Beaux-Arts style. And so Hunt's buildings once lined the streets of New York City. Now only 3 of them remain. There's the pedestal of the Statue of Liberty, there's the Vanderbilt family mausoleum on Staten Island, And then there's the entrance to the Met, which is Wing D. And the Met is an interesting building in New York City. Typically, if a building was too small, outgrown its footprint, they knocked it down, they built something bigger. That was knocked down, they built something bigger. Buildings did not last a long time in the Gilded Age, but they didn't do that at the Met. Instead, they kept on adding wings. And so in some respects, the Met has become this kind of living, breathing architectural reflection of architectural styles throughout the decades in New York City over the last 150 years. And like I said, this was Wing D. If you go up these steps, which were replaced by Kevin Roach, so they're not the original steps, but you go through the great lobby, past the staircase, right to the back into the layman wing, you turn around, and this is what you see. And this was Wing A. This was the original facade of the Metropolitan Museum. And this was designed by Calvert Vaux in that picturesque Stones of Venice kind of style. And so you can see just how in a very short period of time, we go from the picturesque Gothic of Vaux to this monumental classical style of Hunt. And if you want to become an architect, if you want monuments made after you, architecture is not the profession to go into. This is the only memorial in the entire country to an architect. And that's how well people thought of Richard Morris Hunt. And so when he dies in 1895, this memorial is placed on Fifth Avenue between 70th and 71st Street. The architect is Bruce Price. Bruce Price was the father of Emily Post, who wrote the book on etiquette. And it also features sculpture by Daniel Chester French. And so on the left, we have the figure of art, and on the right, we have the figure of architecture, and the figure of architecture is holding a model of the administration building that Hunt designed for the Chicago World's Fair for the White City. And the reason it was placed here, this specific monument, is so that it would overlook what was considered his great masterpiece, which was the Lenox Library. That was great until, unfortunately, the Lenox Library was demolished in 1912 to make way for the home of probably the most hated robber baron of the Gilded Age, Henry Clay Frick. And after a tumultuous business relationship with Andrew Carnegie, Frick sells his stake in U.S. Steel. He already has a summer house 2 hours north of here in Beverly, in Massachusetts, but he moves from Pittsburgh to New York, and he rents one half of the Vanderbilt Triple Palace on Fifth Avenue between 51st and 52nd Street. And this is, in essence, 2 buildings which were designed for William H. Vanderbilt. They were designed by Charles Atwood and Herder Brothers. And the southernmost building, which is the one closest to you in this image, was occupied by William. The northernmost one was actually a duplex, which was meant for his 2 daughters, for Margaret and Emily Thorne Vanderbilt. And in between the two was a courtyard and a covered loggia. So this meant that the 2 sisters could come and visit their parents without ever leaving the property. And in the background, you see the Petit Chateau, and further up between the 2 churches, you see the University Club, which had recently been finished by Charles McKim. And Frick had long admired the Triple Palace, and when William died, it was inherited by his son, George Washington Vanderbilt II. George is busy, rather preoccupied building Biltmore, and so he rents it out to Henry Clay Frick. And Frick is fine living there until one day he takes this carriage ride through Central Park, and he gets off at 96th Street. And as he's coming back along Fifth Avenue, they drive past this Georgian mansion, which was surrounded by gardens. And this was actually the carriage entrance to this house, which is now the Cooper Hewitt Museum of Design, was the inspiration for the entrance to the Russell House in the TV series. And it's kind of unusual because up until then, homes weren't surrounded by gardens. Homes in New York City came all the way to the sidewalk so they could take advantage of all the real estate. So this was rather luxurious to have a house surrounded by gardens. And Frick asks his carriage driver, whose house is this? And so he tells him, well, it's Andrew Carnegie's new house. And so Frick, in an era of rivalries, says, I'm going to make a house that'll make Andy's look like a miner shack. This is an era of one-upmanship, of spite. People built spite mansions. This is an ongoing theme that we will see. And so he hires the dream team of Thomas Hastings, the architect who had just finished New York Public Library. Interestingly, Hastings had apprenticed with Herder Brothers early on before he went to the École and before he went to McCumey and White. And so there's a very good chance he might have worked on the Triple Palaces. Next to him is Sir Charles Allom, the British decorator who had just been knighted for working on Buckingham Palace. And then next to him is Lord Joseph Devine, the purveyor of European art and antiquities, who had showrooms in London, Paris, and New York. And the Frick is very much the French Hotel Particulier style. I've almost felt that this is kind of more at home here in Newport than what it is in the hustle and bustle of urban New York. But when Frick purchased this property in 1906, but as a condition of the sale, the Lenox Library had to remain intact until New York Public Library was finished and the collection could be moved. And it would take another 5 years to complete New York Public Library. In total, New York Public Library took 16 years to build. And Frick accused the workers of working slow intentionally to spite him because of his union-busting ways. And he actually even offered to have the Lenox Library moved to another location if the city would provide a parcel of land. And of course, the city was too dysfunctional to do that, and the Lenox Library was sadly lost to us. And when that was demolished, it would take just 2 years to build this. So 16 years for New York Public Library and just 2 years for the Frick collection. And this was, so originally when you entered into the mansion, you went through a courtyard and you entered into the house via a porte cochere. And when the house was later converted in 1932 by John Russell Pope, he moved he salvaged the porte cochere and he moved it forward to the street, which is now the entrance to the Frick. And if you look in the pediment, you see this scandalously nude lady lying there, and it's modeled on a lady called Audrey Marie Munson. She was better known as Miss Manhattan. She was a particular favorite of Daniel Chester French, and you see her all over Manhattan. And actually, one of the figures in the Hunt Memorial opposite is actually based on her as well. And you enter inside the house, and everything is finished in Botticino marble. The balustrade to the staircase was designed by Allom, and pretty much all of the interior of this house was designed by Sir Charles Allom. Hastings had almost nothing to do with it. And part of that was because Hastings and Frick did not get along. Some of the letters that Frick wrote to Hastings, you're like, wow. Anyway, hope I never get a letter like that from one of my clients. But so because of that, he was a nervous wreck and really didn't contribute too much to the inside and left it all to Allom. And even the grand staircase, you see the organ, which is there. And it used to be rumored that this organ was salvaged out of a home in England, Sir Christopher Wren home. It wasn't. It was made in New York City to the specifications of Sir Charles Allom. And one of the things that's interesting about the Frick mansion is there's no ballroom. And so because there's no ballroom, there's nowhere for an orchestra to play. And so that's why they incorporated an organ into the design of the space. And Frick would pay an organist, Archer Gibson, an annual salary of $400,000 to play the organ each night to his guests. And when we felt so special when we took this photograph. This was obviously before COVID, and now the Frick is closed, it's undergoing the renovations, and the rooms upstairs, which the Frick used as their offices, were the bedrooms, and they were designed by Elsie de Wolf. And when the Frick reopens, those rooms will now be galleries, and you'll be able to see the original Elsa de Wolfe rooms. But normally people are not allowed up the staircase, so we felt so special to be allowed onto the landing. Now everybody's going to be able to go up there, so it's not quite as special. But we're taking this photograph, and John says to me, you know, I can fit everything in up to that little picture on the left. And the lady we're with says, did you just call that a little picture? And we went, yeah. She goes, it's a Vermeer. And we're like, okay, but it's still a little picture. And then you get into the dining room, again, all designed by Alom. Over the fireplace is the painting by John Hopner of the ladies Sarah and Catherine Bly. And one of the things that Duveen did, he was very crafty. When he purchased his mantelpiece, he made sure to purchase one that was deep enough, so then he could sell Frick some Ming vases to put on it. And then the next room, the famous room, is the Fragonard room. This was added actually a year after the house was completed. This was originally the drawing room, and these panels were purchased from the estate of J.P. Morgan. Believe it or not, when Morgan passed away, his family had a hard time paying his inheritance taxes. And that's because most of Morgan's fortune was in art and antiquities and not cash. And famously at his funeral, John D. Rockefeller said, he owned us all and he wasn't even that rich. And when they put these panels in, Duveen had them put in higher up than what they typically would be. So that's why there's such a small crown in the room. And that was, again, so he could get them off the floor and so he could sell Frick furniture to place below them. And then you get into the living room, which is all oak panels. You've got the famous El Greco of St. Jerome over the fireplace, and then either side of it are the two Holbeins of Sir Thomas More and Thomas Cromwell. And Duveen sold a lot of questionable pieces to a lot of newly minted millionaires, but he reserved the good stuff for Morgan, for Frick, and especially for Andrew Mellon. And so much so that it's kind of interesting that those three private collections from the Gilded Age would become the centerpieces of three of the most important civic collections in this country. Most of Morgan's collection would become the backbone of the Metropolitan Museum. Mellon's collection would become the National Gallery of Art in Washington, D.C., and Frick, obviously, the Frick collection. And when Carnegie and Frick actually passed away within just a few months of each other. Their lives are kind of intertwined. You can't get away from them. And when Carnegie knew that he was coming towards the end of his days, he had his intermediaries reach out to Frick because he wanted to smooth over things. And Frick famously said, you know, you can tell Carnegie, I'll meet him in hell. And one of the things that when Carnegie purchased his property on Fifth Avenue between 90th and 91st Street, it was a lot further north than the fashionable Millionaires Row, which was his intention. He was a very private man, and he welcomed the peace and quiet away from the Vanderbilts, who were a little bit too loud for his taste. But to achieve this, he actually also purchased all of the neighboring lots around his house, so that way he could control who his neighbors would be. And despite not liking the Vanderbilts, he did sell 2 adjacent lots on 91st Street to William Douglas Sloan and to Emily Thorne Vanderbilt as wedding gifts to give to their 2 daughters, Adele and Emily. And the reason for doing that was Frick's mother was actually childhood friends with Sloane's mother, not Frick's mother, Carnegie's mother, sorry, was childhood friends with Sloane's mother growing up in Scotland. And so that's why he agreed to the sale. And Emily Thorne Vanderbilt is the 3rd generation of the Vanderbilt. She is the grandchild of the Commodore. And she and her siblings build some of the finest homes this country has ever seen. Obviously, we're sat in one this evening, designed for Cornelius. We have a marble house just down the road for William. George had Biltmore built, and so all three of those by Richard Morris Hunt. Frederick would have Hyde Park on the Hudson, and not to be outdone, Emily would have Elm Court in Lenox, which was designed by Peabody and Stern, in what is the largest shingle-style house ever built in this country. And like many of high society, the Sloanes would summer first in Lenox, then they would go to Bar Harbor, in Maine, then they would come here to Newport, and then they would go to Beverly before they would come back into New York City. And their daughter, Adele, would especially like her time in Lenox, because in Lenox, the rules of etiquette were not as rigidly followed as they were in New York City and here in Newport. And so she would be able to go out riding in the rolling hills of Lenox with all of her suitors without the need of a chaperone. And one of these suitors was the gentleman here, James Burden. He is the heir to an ironworks in Troy, New York. Troy, New York is where they filmed a lot of the exterior scenes for the TV series. And the couple were married in Lenox in 1895 at Trinity Episcopal Church, which is where all of high society worshiped. The reception was at Elm Court, and then they honeymooned in Biltmore. So they were keeping it all in the family. And Richard Morris Hunt was invited to the wedding because he's the architect for the Vanderbilt family. And he's here in Newport, he's working on this building. And his wife tells him not to go to the wedding. She goes, "You're not feeling well, don't go." But he feels obligated that he's got to go because he doesn't want to offend the Vanderbilts. So he travels all the way to Newport, to Lenox. On his way back, to make things worse, he gets caught in a thunderstorm, he gets pneumonia, and a month later, he's passed away. And he's buried here at Island Cemetery in Newport. And if Hunt had been alive, no doubt he would have built the homes for Emily and Adele. Instead, Emily would hire, now she's married to John Hammond, who was a chief of staff for General Sherman. And Emily hired Carrere and Hastings to design the Italian palazzo. So if you look at the archival picture, that's the little sliver that you can see, very much in the Italian style, which was typical of the times. It is now the Russian consulate, which is why we do not have a lot of good photographs along 91st Street. So you got this little vignette and this archival shot, and that was all we were willing to risk. But Adele hires Warren and Wetmore to design her mansion in what is really this kind of French interpretation of an Italian palazzo. Interestingly, the two rival firms did coordinate their efforts together because they allowed for a garden between the two homes. And so carriages would come in through the garden and they would go off in either direction to depending which house they were going to. But just like at the Triple Palace, what it did was it allowed for the two sisters to visit each other without ever having to leave the property. And so with Beaux-Arts architecture, I think it's very much this sense of theater, this sense of procession. And Warren was very much a master at that. And actually, I just want to go back a second. Let's see if I can go back. There we go. If you look at the detail shot, what makes this building interesting is typically with an Italian palazzo, the principal rooms are on the second floor, what we call the piano nobile. What Warren did was he inserted this extra floor, so you see those little square kind of windows. So that's an extra floor, so the principal rooms are on the third floor. And that meant that those windows could be a lot taller than what they would be in an Italian house because it's different proportions. And so they're the windows which are in the ballroom. But you come in through the porte cochere where you're dropped off, and anybody who's ever seen the movie Perfect Murder with Gwyneth Paltrow in it, that's filmed inside this. Michael Douglas is in it as well. That's filmed inside this house. But because of the extra flight, you've got the extra floor with the principal rooms being on the third floor, you have an extra flight of stairs to come up. And so this sweeping staircase extends to that kind of sense of drama. And as you're coming up this staircase, you hardly feel that you're walking up it. The treads are so perfectly proportioned. And this is what's above you. In the center is this stained glass by Tiffany. And then around it is this mural called Arts and Sciences. It's by Hector Despuy, who was actually a professor at the École des Beaux-Arts. He was friends with Warren. Architects who study classical architecture know him because he wrote a number of books, which everyone has in their collections. But you would come up into this reception room, and this was overlooking the private garden. And you would make your way into the ballroom. And this ballroom overlooked 91st Street, it overlooked the Carnegie Mansion, and its design is very much based upon the Hall of Mirrors at Versailles. It's a blending of kind of 14th and of Louis XIV and Louis XV styles. And it's here that the Burdens did all of their entertaining. Two of their favorite guests were Puccini and Mark Twain. And the room has this exquisite detail, like something you'd find here in Newport, with the white and rose marble, the plaster and gilt decoration, and I love the little kind of cherubs up there playing their musical instruments. And in 1913, Carnegie would sell the property to the west of the Burden Mansion on the corner of Fifth Avenue to this gentleman, one of the great characters of the Gilded Age, Otto Hermann Kahn. And for anyone who has ever played Monopoly, this is who the figure of Mr. Monopoly is based on. He was a very dapper dresser. This is a time where wealthy people are the celebrities of the day, and the newspapers would literally report every single day what he was wearing. He is responsible for my favorite quote from the Gilded Age, which is, "It's a sin to keep money idle." I've tried to explain that to my clients. They don't quite get that. And Julian, he's also a favorite of Julian's. Julian actually specifically mentions him in the foreword to the book. And Kahn was responsible for building one of the great estates on Long Island's Gold Coast, Oaxaca Castle, which is an anagram of his name, Otto Hermann Kahn. This was completed in 1919 by Delano and Aldridge. It was the second largest home ever built in America, behind only Biltmore. And this is where Kahn would spend his weekends. He loved to play golf, but he was terrible at it. And so the stories go that if he hit into a bunker, the next week that bunker had been moved. And if he missed the green was moved a little bit as well. And his mansion on 91st Street is based on the papal chancellery in Rome. And he actually hired quite an obscure English architect, J. Armstrong Stenhouse, to design this. Another architect who we'll talk about in a minute, C.P.H. Gilbert, was the architect of record. And I have a whole chapter in the book dedicated to this house. But for expediency, we're going to move along. And so if you do want to see more of this house, you're going to have to buy copies of the book. But in the 1940s, the Kahn Mansion and the Burden Mansion were both purchased by the Convent of Sacred Heart. They are now combined inside into the campus of their all-girls school. And believe it or not, this is where Lady Gaga went to school. So moving on to this granite-clad French Baroque palace on the corner of Madison Avenue and 37th Street. This was built for Joseph Delamare. And if anyone knows their insignia, you'll be able to recognize the Polish flag because this is now the Polish consulate in New York City. And when the newspapers of the day wrote the obituary of Joseph Delamare, they said his story reads like a romance novel. He was born in Holland, and as a 7-year-old, he stows aboard a ship on its way to the Dutch West Indies. And he finally makes his way to Martha's Vineyard, where he starts his own salvage company. And then after that, he goes west to try his hand at prospecting. And he hits copper, he hits nickel, he hits silver, he hits everything except for gold. And he makes an absolute fortune. He comes back to New York City, and nobody knows who he is, and he has this vast amount of money, and so the newspapers refer to him as the American Count of Monte Cristo. And he wants to be admitted into New York high society, but he needs to find a suitable wife. And so in 1893, the 50-year-old Delamar meets 17-year-old Nellie Virginia Sands, not far from here at Narragansett Pier. And although she was from modest means, she was a reputed beauty, and she was actually a descendant of John Quincy Adams. And so after a quick courtship, the two end up getting married, and 2 years later, they would spend the summer here in Newport. They rented out Kingscote from the King's family. But the Delamars, and especially Nellie, were not particularly well received by New York society. And the New York Journal reported, I'm going to quote this so that you don't think I'm making this up. The New York Journal said, the men said that Mrs. Delamar was too pretty to be tolerated by their wives. And so the couple, they have a daughter, Alice, but not surprisingly, Nellie is caught having an affair with a much younger man. They divorce. Joseph comes back to New York City with his daughter, Alice, and he concentrates his efforts on building this lavish mansion and trying to now get his daughter included into high society. And he purchases this property in Murray Hill on the corner of Madison Avenue and 37th Street, and it's next to the brownstones belonging to J.P. Morgan. J.P. Morgan had purchased three adjacent brownstones between 36th Street and 37th Street. The one to the south he kept for himself. The one in the middle they knocked down, turned it into a garden. That garden is now the entrance to the Morgan Museum Complex, which was done by Renzo Piano. Morgan's house was knocked down and replaced with the Annex building by Benjamin Whiston Morris. And this building to the north was for his son, Jack. That still exists and is still part of the Morgan complex. But Delamar had tried to do business with Morgan on a number of occasions, and Morgan had always rebuffed him. And so I mentioned before spite mansions. This is another spite mansion. He vows that he's going to build a mansion that will cast a shadow over the home of J.P. Morgan. And so to achieve this, he hires C.P.H. Gilbert. And C.P.H. Gilbert is not related to Cass Gilbert at all. People always confuse the two. Cass Gilbert, obviously the designer of the Woolworth Building in the Supreme Court. But C.P.H. Gilbert was very much society architect. After Hunt, he probably became the most foremost society architect in New York City. And he's best known for actually designing in the Vanderbilt Gothic style that Hunt made famous. His most famous example of that is probably the Felix Warburg house, which is now the Jewish Museum on 92nd Street. And this was a house that was designed for great entertaining. The second floor, the Piano Noble, has just 3 rooms. And so visitors would come up this staircase, and as they climbed up the staircase, the butler would be there waiting for them. And he would motion up to the orchestra, who would be in the balcony playing, for them to stop so that he could announce them, and then he would motion back to them and they would start playing their music again. And to the east is the Pompeian Room, which is where Delamar kept all of his prize art collections, including The Greek Slave by Hiram Powers. And to the west, sorry, to the east, to the west, yes, is the ballroom with this beautiful red damask wall coverings, mirrored panels, and carved decoration. And if you don't like gilding, this is not the building to go and visit. It was purchased in 1973 by the Polish government. They brought in craftsmen from Poland who did a wonderful restoration on this, and we're really indebted to them to letting us have access to photograph this. Having said that, the security guards there looked like they were members of the Polish version of the SEALs, and they kept on walking around to look at us. And it's like, anyway, unfortunately, this house hosted very few parties. Alice really had no intention of being included into high society. She was very much a tomboy, and during the First World War, she would actually serve as an army mechanic, and she would go on to have a 60-year relationship with the actress, producer, author Eva Le Gallienne. And Delamare would retreat to the Gold Coast, to his estate there, Pembroke, also designed by C.P.H. Gilbert. This was completed in 1914. It was considered one of the finest homes on the Gold Coast, and this was sadly lost to us in the 1960s. And Delamare passed away age 75 in 1918, and he is interred at Woodlawn Cemetery in the Bronx. And Woodlawn is the last chapter in the book, and it's where I wanted to finish the talk this evening by taking a quick look at 3 of the mausoleums in the cemetery. And in many ways, these mausoleums are the final homes, the final architectural commissions of their famous residents. And we go one morning very early on to take these photos, and we're waiting for the lady from Woodlawn to show us around and give us access to all of these built wonderful mausoleums. And we're stood talking to a couple of the security guards. And one of them says to me, he goes, "I can tell from your accent, you're not from the Bronx." And before I could say anything to him, he said, "Are you from Brooklyn?" But this was the first major mausoleum purchase. It's right in the center of Woodlawn, and this was designed for Jay Gould, the king of the robber barons. He planned well in advance. This was built 8 years actually before he died. It's based on the Temple of Theseus. And of course, in the Gilded Age, the character of George Russell is played by Morgan Spector, is very much based upon the character Jay Gould. And along with his partners, Gould would manipulate the stock market to cause the financial panic of 1869 and what would become the first Black Friday. And the Commodore, Cornelius Vanderbilt, said of him, "It never pays to kick a skunk." And when he passed away and his sarcophagus was put inside the mausoleum, they actually welded the doors shut. And the newspapers reported that was so that it would stop his soul from escaping and causing more havoc on Wall Street. But in reality, there was actually, at the time, families were worried about grave robbers because people would come in and they would steal the remains and they would ransom them back to wealthy families. So this was a way to prevent that from happening. And just as George Russell is based on a real-life person, so is Carrie Coon's portrayal of Bertha Russell, which obviously is based upon Alva Vanderbilt, who would become Alva Belmont. And after the death of Richard Morris Hunt, Alva would continue to work with the Hunt family. She worked with his 2 sons, Richard and Joseph. They designed the Belmont Mansion in New York City on Madison Avenue and 51st Street, which was just 1 block away from the Petit Chateau. But they would also go on to design Alva's final resting place, which is the Belmont Chapel at Woodlawn. She is buried inside here, along with her second husband, Oliver Belmont. And the mausoleum was completed after the death of Belmont. It is based upon a chapel in the Loire Valley, which is said to be the resting place of Leonardo da Vinci. I did this talk once and I messed up. I said Leonardo DiCaprio. But Leonardo da Vinci, Leonardo DiCaprio is still alive. And the outside is this wonderful carving over the entrance to it, which was by Francois Tonetti, who actually did a lot of the sculpture on the outside of New York Public Library. And inside, you get to see Alva's suffragette banner. The interiors feature stained glass by Helen Maitland Armstrong. And I was told that she contributed towards some of the stained glass inside Trinity Church here in Newport, but I went in earlier today and I couldn't verify that, so maybe somebody here knows more about that than I do. But it also has this beautiful decorative painting inside, which was actually done by William Andrew McKay. and he worked on many of Alva's projects. He did much of the murals inside the Chinese tea house at Marble House. Now, the largest of the mausoleums at Woodlawn was built for a couple that no one has ever heard of. All these famous people that live or reside, I should say, in Woodlawn. It also includes Frank Woolworth and Hollis Huntington. Joseph Pulitzer's there as well. But this was designed for a couple called John and Kate Harbeck. And I'm going to end with this because this story feels like it should be in the Gilded Age TV series. And so John is a prosperous warehouse merchant, and he meets the already married Caroline Montgomery, and the two of them live together for 7 years in this fashionable townhouse on 55th Street, where they entertain a lot. They very much become members of high society. Then 37-year-old John meets an 18-year-old telegraph operator called Kate. They have a whirlwind romance. They get married. And Caroline sues for divorce settlement. She wants a proportion of his estate, but the two were never married. And so this becomes fodder for the tabloids of the day. It makes its way all the way to the Supreme Court, who ruled in John's favor. But despite that, they are now shunned by high society. And so John and Kate have to leave New York City, and they spend almost the rest of their life living overseas in Paris. John dies in 1910, and Kate vows that she's going to build this mausoleum to spite everybody, see the theme of spite everybody who shunned them in New York society. And so they hire Crane Hastings to design this wonderful Byzantine structure. It's absolutely massive, and you can see all this carving on the outside of it. And when you enter, you come in through these massive bronze doors, and this isn't open very often, and so it needed like 4 guys to push these doors open. They kind of creaked open, and right in front of you is this stained glass window by Tiffany called Christ in Majesty, and above is this dome, which is finished in gold leaf, and over the years, the gold leaf has kind of come dislodged, and it's flickered down, and it just looks magical when you kind of see it there, like dust on the floor and over the sarcophagus. And no expense was spared on this. It's this real kind of jewelry box. And Kate would join John 20 years later. She passed away on New Year's Eve, 1930, at the Plaza Hotel in what the newspapers called a freak revolving door accident. So when Julian kills off one of his cast in a freak revolving door accident, you're gonna know what the inspiration for that storyline was. And with that, that's it. Thank you very much. And I believe I finished on time, which is a miracle. So if anybody has any questions.
Hello. So are there any aspects of architecture coming out of this point in time that you can sort of, if you were just looking at a house or a building from this time period, you looked at it and you saw one detail or one theme, you could say, oh, that was built during the Gilded Age? Or are they all really just so distinct that there's not something like that?
When I agreed to do this, it was only if easy questions were asked.
Sorry.
So I think, in anything, when you go from one shift in style to another, it tends to be quite dramatic. And so what we do in our book is we show everything chronologically. So you can see the Tilden houses up front, so you see kind of the influence of, like I said, the Victorian picturesque. In the middle of the book, you've got the big behemoth Beaux-Arts buildings like Grand Central and New York Public Library and the Met. And then as you get towards the end, you see the influence of Art Deco coming in and modernism. And so you're kind of really going from, the term Renaissance just means rebirth, and it's a rebirth in the arts. And it's appropriate to use that term here because people like J.P. Morgan and Otto Kahn, they thought of themselves as being modern-day versions of the Medicis from the Italian Renaissance, who are also patrons to the arts as well as being bankers. And so that's really that notion of decoration. One of the other talks that I give is the importance of mural painting and sculpture, where that and architecture all went together. And so that's really, when you see those three coming together, that's when you kind of know it's a building from this period. When you get into modernism where there's no detail. And so that's where the shift kind of occurs.
Okay, thank you.
Hi. As a practicing architect, are there any architectural designs from the Gilded Age that you are inspired by and trying to incorporate into your own work today?
I was actually, you know what? I was pointing this out earlier on to my better half, Teresa, when we went around Marble House. And you have to look past just how ostentatious it is, because most people have got simpler tastes and don't have the same budgets nowadays. But you can look at details. And so, for example, one of the details that I actually love at Marble House is, as the staircase comes down, what is the stair stringer sweeps out and becomes the chair rail. Well, that's something that you can do now, and something I do quite often. And so you can look at details like that, and which are incredibly well worked out, and use them for buildings today.
Thank you.
Thank you so much for a wonderful lecture, Mr. Dodd. I would like to invite everyone out to the terrace for a reception as well as a book signing. Thank you.